Okay, good evening, everyone. And I've posted the link again on the chat group for those who, because no one managed to print it today because I sent the link out quite late, and I'll also put the link in the YouTube recording. So I wanted to look at the Poskim of Mon, the Manna, the Mon, the second miracle that occurs in this week's Sedra after the incident of after the major nace of the Sedra, which of course is Kriyas Yamsuf. The second miracle that occurs is the Mon that falls. And what I really wanted to do was look at several halachic discussions around Mon, because the Poskim speak about it from a halachic perspective. And it's always interesting when they take a narrative section in the Torah and look at it through the eyes of halacha and psak, when there isn't any overt halachas that emerge from this. It's simply telling us a story of an incredible miracle of the falling of the Mon. And what I hope we'll be able to come out with is some surprising conclusions, philosophical, hashkafic, spiritual messages that derive from the relatively dry halachic works of the Poskim, who discuss halachic effects that emerge. Now, on page 1 and through to a bit of page 2, I printed the Psukim. I'm not going to learn through them, but just because we will reference them a little here and there. But basically, the narrative is that in the first few Psukim, the Psukim tell us that Klal Yisrael journeyed into the desert, and they complained to Moshe and Aaron, and they said, what have we gained by leaving Egypt? We were fed. Here in the Midbar, we are starving. They also reference the fact that in Egypt they had basar, they had meat, the sir habasar, the flesh of pot, the pot of flesh that they remember there in Egypt. Incidentally, someone a couple of years back gave me a book on the archaeology of Egypt as a gift, and I was reading through it, and the archaeologists have discovered that the Egyptians used to feed their slaves well. They didn't believe in starving their slaves. They used to feed them well. And in the slave quarters, there's significant remnants of fish and meat bones and other such things. The Egyptians used to give their slaves good quantities of meat so they could work hard. And the Torah records this, in which, despite whatever other afflictions there were in Egypt, perhaps they didn't get the luxury bread, the risen bread, but meat and fish and things they got as per the records of the stories in Egypt. So Hashem responds to Moshe, Pasuk 4, that I'm going to rain bread. I'm going to rain bread from the heavens. And then there's a sort of digression to Hilchos Shabbos. And we learn actually several important halachas from Shabbos from this. For example, in Pasuk 5, it says, on Friday, Erev Shabbos, they should prepare, from which we learn that Hachana has to be done on Erev Shabbos, preparation has to be done on Erev Shabbos, but on Shabbos you can't prepare things, the concept of Mukta, the idea that everything has to be prepared from before Shabbos, etc. Then Pasuk 15, Klal Yisrael are puzzled when this falls, Vayomer Ishalachiv, each person turns to their brother, and they say to one another, Manhu, what is this? Ki lo yodu mahu, they didn't know what it was. Vayomer Moshe Aleim, and Moshe says, this is the lechem which Hashem has given you to eat. This is the bread which Hashem has given you to eat. So they're puzzled what it is. Then Moshe tells them to gather it in. He tells them, don't leave leftovers, Pasuk 19. Don't leave leftovers. Pasuk 20, there were those who left leftovers who didn't listen to Moshe, and Hashem was angry with them. Pasuk 22 and on, they're told, or they notice rather, that on Friday, Lechem Mishnah, a double portion of Mon falls, and they come puzzled to Moshe, and Moshe says to them, Pasuk 23 at the bottom of page 1, this is what Hashem has told you, that that which is baked, that which is cooked, but you can't cook and bake on Shabbos, and therefore double has fallen, eat today, ki Shabbos hayom la'Hashem, etc. Finally, the Parsha concludes with an instruction from Moshe to put to Aaron to put a tzinsenes, take a vase, a jar, and store Mon there so it can be seen through the generations. And this is the end of the Parsha of Mon. And what we're going to try and do is look at as I mentioned, the thought of the Poskim around these areas. So the first question is really raised by a Gemara. And the Gemara in Brachos, we're now on page 2, and again, I'll just put the sources for those in the chat for those who didn't have them on the YouTube. The Gemara in Brachos is discussing the origins of Birchas Hamazon. And the Gemara says that, in essence, Birchas Hamazon is from V'achalta v'savata or Ve'rachta. It's a pasuk in Sefer Devarim, chapter 8, which tells us that lists the 7 species, which of course we'll focus on next week and on Tu B'Shvat, the beginning of next week. Then the pasuk mentions the gifts of Eretz Yisrael, that his bread, lechem, it's blessed with resources, with bread. And then the pasuk says, "V'chalta v'svata v'irachta," you should eat and be satiated and bench. This is the concept of benching after having eaten bread. The Gemara then says that there's 3 elements to this Birchas Hamazon. Quick plug for my Lahavashi, my Thursday night ladies' show, which we're learning Hilchos Brachos, and we're talking about this in detail. The Gemara says there's 3 elements to Birchas Hamazon: v'chalta v'svata, when you eat and are satiated, or beirachta, say a bracha on the eating, which is our first bracha on nutrition. The second bracha al ha'oretz, the pasuk carries on, make a bracha on Eretz Yisrael, and the third bracha ha'toiva, on the source of the goodness of the lands of Israel, which is the Beis Hamikdash and Yerushalayim, and that's our third bracha that we say a bracha on Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash. Then the Gemara bracha says who wrote the actual text of these brachas, and it says Moshe created the first bracha of Birchas Hamazon when the manna descended on the Jewish people. Yehoshua wrote the second bracha when they entered the lands of Israel, and David and Shlomo created the third bracha when they conquered and built Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash. These are the authors of the brachas. Now, ostensibly, this seems to imply that on Mon they said Birchas Hamazon, the after bracha of bread. So was Mon bread? Well, it's lechem min hashamayim, it's bread from the heavens. On the other hand, it's not what we normally think of bread. It doesn't fulfill the halachic criteria of bread. It's not bread. I mean, it's not wheat or barley made into flour, created into bread. It doesn't indeed fulfill the halachic criteria of bread. So Rabbi Yosef Engel, who was a leading Torah scholar in the 1800s, who adopted often the style of pilpul, sort of just interesting, investigative and speculative Torah, rather than actual sort of critical psak halacha, just sort of explored, many of his forums sort of explore Torah concepts without necessarily drawing a discussion to a direct conclusion or deriving a specific halacha. He discusses this printed in source 2. And Rabbi Yosef Engel says, his first point he says is, he questions this Gemara really. Why would you say Birchas Hamazon on Mon, it's not bread? So the first point he says is, well, maybe it's enough that it tastes like bread. Based on the Midrash, and we'll look at this Midrash in a little more detail later, shows that the Mon could taste like anything anyone wanted it to taste like. So is it enough that it tastes like bread? Says Rabbi Yosef Engel, this doesn't seem so clear-cut, because the halacha is that we don't make brachas on taste, we only make brachas on foods. If you have a taste without consumption of food, you don't make a bracha. So for example, if you're cooking some soup and you want to taste the soup to check whether it's tasty or not, as long as you don't swallow the soup and you just take a spoonful of soup and you gargle it around in your mouth and then spit it out, no bracha is said on this soup. So do you indeed make a bracha on taste? Then Rabbi Yosef Engel says, well, maybe it literally became bread. Maybe the nature of a miracle, and this is where you see where halacha and hashkafa, philosophy, begin correlating. Maybe the nature of a miracle is that it actually becomes bread. In other words, what is the nature of this mon? When you choose it to taste like bread, does it become bread? Does it take on the properties of bread? Is it only taste, or is it the properties of bread? If you gave it to a chemist to analyze, what properties would a food technologist to analyze, what properties would they see of this bread? Would they see it as lechem, or would they see it as something else? So this is the second point you make. Maybe somehow the nature of the miracle of it tasting like bread is indeed adopts bread-like properties in every respect. So this is the second point he makes. He then records an interesting discussion around the episode of Nodov and Avihu, who entered the Mishkan somehow in an inappropriate way, Acharemos and Shemini and Acharemos, and they died. A fire came down from heaven and killed them. What did they do wrong? So one opinion in the Gemara is that they were shasuye yayin. They were drinkers of wine. Asks Rabbi Yosef Engel, where did they get wine in the desert? Where were the grapes in the desert? Where did they get this wine from? So he brings a medrash that says that the Be'er Shel Miriam, the water of the Be'er Shel Miriam, could also taste like anything one wished it, any drink one wished it. So if you enjoyed 7-Up, you can make it taste like 7-Up. And if you enjoyed wine, you can make it taste like wine. So again, there he discusses, can you get drunk on Be'er Shel Miriam wine? Did it assume all the properties of wine? Part of the quality of wine is yayin yisamach levav enoish. So would you get drunk on it if you drank the Be'er Shel Miriam? Would it have the properties of wine? And he suggests that it would have the properties of wine in line with his thinking. He mentions a ritva, and here we're now talking about the era of the Rishonim. So this is not just a speculative thought, something of grave halachic significance. The ritva is a Talmud of the Ramban, a senior Rishon, very important Rishon. The Ritva discusses whether you could make matzah from mon. And the Ritva says you can't, seeming to indicate that mon doesn't have full wheat-like properties. I mean, the halacha is you can only make something from matzah which has the potential to become chomet, in other words, it has gluten in. So did mon have gluten-type properties or not? He then records a Tosfos who discusses or assumes that in the Midbar they weren't able to bring the shtei halechem, the bread karbonos in that were brought on Shavuos, on the Chag, the festival of Shavuos, the shtei halechem, which were the first loaves of the barley of the barley crop, the wheat crop, that was brought in the Beis Hamikdash. And Tosfos says they couldn't have brought this the whole 40 years because they didn't have a wheat crop in the Midbar. Where would they have got a wheat crop from? So this is Rabbi Yosef Engel's sort of speculative discussion around the nature of mon. So this is sort of the well-known source around the topic. To my amazement, I then discovered that there was a source from Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam. Those who went with us to Cairo will know that, to Cairo Geniza, I'm sorry, we didn't go to Cairo, unfortunately, but to the Cairo Geniza in Oxford, will know that we discussed the remarkable figure of Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam, very important Rishon, heir to, obviously, to the traditions of the Rambam, perhaps somewhat overshadowed by his great father, but again, a very, very significant figure. And Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam, and this we will look at inside, was asked by the community of Yemen whether they should or could make hamotzi on their bread, even though their bread was made from a different type of grain. It was made from what he calls doichen and dara. I don't know what dara is. Durum wheat? Is there durum wheat? Is there such a wheat? Dura wheat? It seems to be maize and some other sort of corn. So they made bread from a corn that wasn't from the wheat and barley family. And Rabbi Avraham ben Harambam says, no, you can't make, you don't make hamotzi or bechas hamazon on this. You don't mention this because the pasuk says v'chalta v'svata on lechem, on bread, and this isn't halachic bread. This is vegetable pie, perhaps, but it's not bread if it's not made from the wheat or barley family of grains. Then they said to him, well, what about mon, on which the Gemara seems to imply that bechas hamazon is made? And Avraham says this is a beautiful question. Whoever asked this has zakus hamoach, has a refinement of mind, or bina ma'ura, and great understanding. So what compliment to get from Avraham and Rambam. Nonetheless, he says, I don't think this is comparable. And let's have a quick look at the bottom of page 2, source 4. Or Masha Hizkir Hatoyin, this is source 4 of Avraham and Rambam, that which the claimant claims, Shebirchat Hazon Moshe Olav Hashan Tikna, that Moshe wrote Birchas Hamazon, because this was their bread. In other words, the logic of the claimants is that you see that each society makes Birchas Hamazon on its bread. So if you are in South America, living amongst or Middle America, living amongst the Aztecs, the Incas, and they have cornbread there, that's your bread. If you're in China and you have rice bread, that's your bread. And if you're in Yemen and you have dura or doichen, then that's your bread. That's the bracha that you make. That's what you make. And you see that from the Jewish people in the Midbar, where their bread was mon. Says Rabbi Avram ben Aram, Harayofer time with the top line. This is a good, a beautiful claim. Or Morazan, this indicates al zakut ma'ach bina ma'ula, on a refinement of the brain and a great comprehension. Ella, sheyesh name of their state shuvas. There are two responses. Harishona, the first, the whole of the Jewish people were gathered there in the desert, and that was their bread. Or B'nai Taimim, and my dear friends from Yemen, Einam Kol Yisrael v'lo Rabam. I've got news for you. You're not the whole of the Jewish people, you're not the Rov. In other words, it may be if the whole of the Jewish people adopt a new lechem, a remarkable idea, a new bread, this will have the halachic status of bread. But you Yemen are a tiny corner of the Jewish world. You don't have the ability to redefine what's considered bread in halachic terminology. The Einam Eidim Elam Mimachal Rov Yisrael. We only learn halacha from Rov Yisrael, from the majority practice of Israel. But Shuvah Shniya v'hiya Meduyaka, and the second answer, and the more precise one, at the bottom of page 2, She'ein anu mevarchim. We don't bless now at the top of page 3. Birchat Hamazon. We don't say the bracha of Birchat Hamazon. Mipnei Shelapia Kabbalah Moshe Arav Hashem Tikkun Zeh B'Shashi Adamon. We don't say Birchat Hamazon because Moshe, the Midrash tells us that Moshe made. Tradition tells us that Moshe made up the bracha then. And Mipnei Shanu Mekayim Hamitzvah Mefreshes B'Pasuk V'Chalta V'Svarta V'Yachta. In other words, it's a very nice tradition that we have that Moshe created the bracha at the mon, but the halachic source of Birchat Hamazon is in Sefer Devarim V'Chalta V'Svarta V'Yachta. That's what determines it, and we need to define bread by what the halachists define it as, not based upon a midrashic tradition as to them benching on mon. Why would they have benched on mon? It's a midrashic tradition, either because Moshe felt it was appropriate to express appreciation to Hashem, and therefore he said, look, say this bracha Birchas Hamazon, but not because the core classic halacha, maybe this was a one-off takana just for that time, but not a classification of what defines Birchas Hamazon. Okay, so just to summarize, the first halachic source we've seen is about the after bracha on mon, and we've seen a range of different stances. We've seen the people of Yemen who wished to prove from mon that whatever is society's bread has Birchas Hamazon, and Rabbi Avram saying maybe, point number one, maybe you would be correct if the whole Jewish people adopt something, and point number two, this isn't the halachic definition of it. So this is the first sort of halachic point that emerges. Secondly, we see a more speculative discussion of Rabbi Yosef Engel, a figure 800 years after Rabbi Avram and Haramam, who says maybe that the miracle of Mon, and maybe even the miracle of the Be'er Shel Miriam, indeed recreates the very molecular structure of the Mon, such that it has a halachic status of wine, yayin, and bread, lechem. That's the second sort of where this halachic discussion goes. Inspiring in our thoughts sort of about what a miracle is, to what degree it changes it, and to what degree you can use Midrash as halachic sources. Yeah.
Because when the mon was first given, the Torah hadn't yet been given, which was the Birchas Hamazon.
Yes.
And of course, it's not till Parsha 8 came. So Devarim is partly new halachos and partly restatement of old ones. So if it was a new one, then even that, let's say, in the 40th year, they wouldn't have previously had to do Birchas Hamazon.
So this is an interesting question. The Gemara says that Moshe created it for the mon. So it doesn't tell us when Moshe created it. And also want us to know when there's Poskim in the Torah on which we're instructed in Devarim to what degree they kept this verse. But it's very interesting that Rabbi Rambam treats this as a potential halachic source with which to Poskim. Okay, the second discussion, which again really dates from the era of the Rishonim, is what bracha Rishona, what full bracha did they make on Mon? Now, why do we make 4 brachas before we eat? So there's no source from it in the Torah. The Gemara says it's tzvara, it's reason. It's reason that it's reason that it's not appropriate to eat without saying a bracha. Again, plug for my Thursday night lavashe, which we discuss the halachas of brachas, and availables are recordings up online. So the Gemara says it's reasonable to make a bracha. So if it's reasonable to make a bracha, what bracha did they make on Mon in the Midbar? And again, it's just fascinating that the Poskim and other sources discuss this. So the Bnei Soscha, who is a Hasidic work, a very important Hasidic work, he says, first of all, he says that this is halacha l'maisa. You have to know this in order to know what bracha to make in the Su'udah of Lev Yosem. So he brings a Midrash that says that when Moshiach comes, we're perhaps familiar with this with the Rachman of Sukkot, we'll have a mystical experience of eating in the Sukkot Shel of Yason. And what will we eat there? According to the Midrash, the mon that was put away in this Sinsenes Shel Amon, in this vase that we saw in the Psukim, that was sealed away for all time, for future times. So what bracha will we make on this? So he brings from early sources who say that the bracha that was made on mon was Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min hashamayim. Very interesting source. We used to saying the bracha of hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who takes bread out of the ground. The early sources say that you say the bracha of hamotzi lechem min hashamayim. Then he says a fascinating mystical point, and I want to share this point because it's a very profound and Kabbalistic point, which the Hasidim publicized, as with so many other Kabbalistic ideas, something that was the practice of the elite under the influence of the Hasidim became more of a mass phenomena. And the background to this is a Gemara in Yoma. So let's have a quick look in the Gemara in Yoma. The Gemara in Yoma, this is source 2 on page 3, discusses the nature of the mon. And the first point it says is about the changing taste of the mon. Kesiv lechem, it's called lechem or kesiv shemen. If you look in the Torah, it gives 3 descriptions of the taste of mon. In our Parsha, in Shemos, it describes it as lechem, and it describes it as tasting of honey. And in Bamidbar, it describes it as oil. And the first source brings that it varied its taste depending on who ate it. For youth, it was like bread. For elderly, it was like oil. And for the children, it was like honey. So this is the first source. The second source, maybe we'll miss out for now. And quickly look at the third source that it brings. Tonu Rabbanon, lechem abirim ochal ish. The mon is described as lechem abirim tehillim, the bread of the avir, the avirim. Which literally means the mighty. What does this mean? What's the bread of the mighty? So the Gemara brings the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Let's just learn this Gemara inside. So this is source 2, the third paragraph. Tanu Rabbanon, lechem abirim achal ish. Hashem caused mon to raise down to them, which was bread of the mighty. Lechem shemalach hasharis oichlen. It's the bread that the angels eat. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. These are the words of Rabbi Akiva. And as Rabbi Akiva says that the mighty people, the mighty ones referenced are the malachim. Then the Gemara brings that Rabbi Shmuel didn't like his explanation. He says, do angels need to eat? We find that when Moshe went up to Har Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, he didn't eat. That was just a visitor. Moshe was a human being visiting. Kal v'chomer, the malachim who are permanently in a spiritual realm, they don't need to eat. And then it brings the view of Rabbi Shmuel, who translates lechem avirim as the bread of the avorim, bread of the limbs, meaning to say that the bread, the mon, was absorbed into all 248 limbs. In other words, it was fully absorbed by the body. It had no waste product whatsoever. So the Bnei Yisachar, after he says the first idea, which is that the bracha you make on bread is lechem min hashamayim, and as I said, this really dates from the Rishonim. He then says maybe you make no bracha at all on mon, and he says that the following Kabbalistic idea. He says all food is physical; it contains within it a spark of spirituality. How does food sustain us? Because it isn't merely a physical product; it's also a spiritual product. We human beings, a person can't live on bread alone. A person has to also live on Devar Hashem, on Motzi Pi Hashem, on the words of God. So we need to sustain when we eat both our physical and spiritual souls. Eating has within it a physical act. It's just an act of calories and taste. And it also has a spiritual content to it. It can be an act of service to Hashem. We can appreciate and enjoy the taste, and we can use that to connect to Hashem, to be grateful to Hashem for the sustenance that He gives us, to enjoy this world and be appreciative of the gifts of life. We can draw spirituality from it. In fact, I think this time last year when I spoke, instead of speaking on the Seder, I spoke on Tu B'Shvat, and I spoke on what it is to eat fruit and the sort of elevation of spirituality within that act. Which is how the Kabbalists and Hasidim have publicized to see all acts of eating. And they see this process as birur, as clarification or selection. And the point they say is that in the same way as when you physically eat, food isn't completely absorbed, and we need to select the nutrition and produce waste of that which can't be absorbed within our bodies. Similarly, spiritual eating, we have to select and draw out the spirituality of the experience in order to be able to elevate it and have this as a spiritual experience. And this, say they, is the point of making a bracha. Why do we make a bracha before we eat? In order to turn it into a spiritual experience, to draw out, to do a birur, a cleansing and a clarification, in order to ensure that it is not just a physical experience, but a spiritual experience too. Okay, so mystical language, but on a very basic level, our eating has to be physical and spiritual. It's physically eating food, and it's spiritual. It's an opportunity to connect to Hashem. But Rabbi Kiva and Rabbi Yishmael in different ways taught us that mon is fundamentally a spiritual food. In Rabbi Kiva's explanation, it's the food that malachim eat. Says Rabbi Yishmael to Rabbi Kiva, what malachim, angels eat food? Rabbi Kiva would answer, yes, of course they don't eat physical food, but they still need to draw energy spiritually. They still sustain themselves. They still live off the divine. And therefore mon is pure, encapsulated spiritual energy. Rabbi Yishmael says, even on the physical level, it doesn't have this selection process. It's completely absorbed. It has no physical waste to it. It's something that is absorbed completely by the body. So there's the parallelism between the spiritual process of digestion, which draws out the spiritual and discards the physical, and the physical process of digestion, which draws out the useful physical and discards the useless, the waste within it. Says the Bnei Sasa, he says, a very interesting anecdote. He says, we were debating this in the Shtibel, in the Hasidic Beis HaMedrash, and there were those who argued that you say, Hamotzi lechem min hashamayim, and there were others who argued you make no bracha at all, because the purpose of a bracha is to connect to Hashem, to draw out the spirituality, to do a Kabbalistic process of birur, of drawing out the sparks of the divine, of making this into a service of Hashem. But mon is in essence a service of Hashem. In essence, it's a spiritual experience. It's the lechem abirim, it's the bread of the mighty. It's the food that's eaten by the angels. It's an angelic eating experience. Such food doesn't need a bracha because it is kuloi. It is completely a spiritual immersion and spiritual connection to Hashem, and therefore doesn't need a bracha to be said at all. This is the second explanation that this is the second point of view of the Bnei Yisachar. There is a third perspective. By the way, you can argue on this viewpoint, and you can say no. The Gemara says that the reason we make brachas is to express thanks to Hashem, and therefore we should thank Hashem for mon like we thank for any food. In source 4 at the bottom page 3, I brought a teshuvah of Reb Ovadia Yosef. I'm not going to go through the whole teshuvah inside. It's a very lengthy teshuvah. I just put pieces of it in an incredible encyclopedic manner of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He brings far more sources than anyone I even knew existed on the topic in a remarkable way. But he does bring a thinker who says, the Gemara says, it's forbidden to benefit from this world without a bracha. The Gemara in bracha says, Svara, it's reasonable that you have to say bracha. Also, a person shouldn't be allowed to benefit from this world without a bracha, implying indeed, like those Hasidic thinkers that argue that on mon you don't need to say a bracha. The Sifano, which I printed, I think in Rabbi Ovadia quote. Did I print the Sifano? Yes, I printed the Sifano, but I just brought it in the name of another teshuvah safe in source 3. The Sifano says that if one collects, the Sifano is discussing why one couldn't collect mon on Shabbos. What would be the prohibition of collecting mon on Shabbos? And he suggests that it would be like harvesting. You're not allowed to uproot a plant on Shabbos. Tolesh, if you uproot something, tolesh dover megeduloi. If you uproot a plant on Shabbos, that's a malacha. That's one of the 39 malachas, creative acts on Shabbos. It's one of the acts of farming that you're not allowed to do. The Zufanu suggests that uprooting mon from the ground, even though it's lechem min hashamayim, it's bread from the heavens, that simply means it's bread provided by Hashem, but it's like tolesh min dover megeduloi. It's like uprooting something from its growing place, and therefore, perhaps indeed the appropriate bracha would be hamotzi lechem min haaretz, because mon also draws energy from the ground. Finally, Rabbi Ovadia says a remarkable idea. Again, he's citing this from a thinker, And he says we can read this in the Poskim, in which they voice their confusion about what the mon is. Let's look back at the sequence of the Poskim. Pasuk Tes Vav. They see the mon. Vayiru b'nei Yisrael, the Jewish people see the mon. Vayomer Yishalachiv, monhu. What is this? Ki lo yadu mahu, because they didn't know what it was. Why are they debating about what it was? It's what's the discussion? Says this halachist. Maybe they're debating, what is this? What bracha do you make on this? What does the lamdan, what does the halachist do when you're presented a new food? You're at someone's house and they serve you some new food. You say to them, what is this? I need to know, is it vegetable? Is it fruit? Is it processed? Is it not? What bracha do we make on this new food? And therefore, perhaps this is what they're saying to this. And that comes along Moshe, Vayomer Moshe, Ale, Moshe says to them, Hu halechem asher nosan Hashem la'achla. This is the bread which Hashem gave you. And therefore the bracha is hamotzi lechem in some shape or form. This is a bracha that of lechem, and therefore a lechem type appropriate bracha needs to be said on this. Okay, so just to summarize the second halachic discussion, which according to the Midrash may be relevant when, please God, we eat mon again when Mashiach comes, according to that Midrashic understanding. We've seen a suggestion that the bracha is hamotzi lechem min ha-shamayim. We've seen a suggestion like the Safana that the bracha is hamotzi lechem min ha-oret. And we've seen a suggestion that no bracha needs to be said at all because it's a purely spiritual thing, not a physical thing. And on spiritual things, we don't make brachas. Mitzvahs lav lehanus nitnu. We don't say brachas on purely spiritual experiences. What should you do when Mashiach comes? I suggest you consult your local competent halachic authority at the time. But according to the innovative reading in the Pesukim, this is indeed what the Jewish people did when the mon came. They looked at each other, so we don't know what this is. And Moshe Poskim for them, this is lechem. This has the status of bread, and therefore that's what you should do. Paralleling what we will have to do when Mashiach comes. So this is a second halachic discussion. There is a third halachic discussion in the Poskim about which has ramifications for cooking on Shabbos. Now there is a debate as to whether raw food can be cooked on Shabbos or not. I'm sorry, I should say this more clearly. Food which can be eaten raw is min haTorah, can be cooked on Shabbos. What is the definition of bishul on Shabbos? We're not allowed to cook on Shabbos, one of the 39 melachas. Does it mean materially changing food through heat, or does it mean making food edible through heat? These are the two models of bishul. Is it a material change, or is it making it into edible food? Now, la halacha, and I printed this, let's turn to the top of page 4, bishul, cooking on Shabbos. La halacha, we paskin that you definitely are not allowed to cook food, even if it can be eaten edibly, even if it can be eaten raw before Shabbos. So if you take carrot, which is perfectly edible raw, and you put it in a pot and cook it on Shabbos, that is definitely asa, and probably asa min haTorah, forbidden min haTorah. Let's have a quick look at the Shulchan Aruch. This is the top of page 4. Bishul, cooking on Shabbos. Shulchan Aruch is the fifth line in that in the sort of that section entitled "Cooking on Shabbos." Shulchan Aruch and Erechaim Siman Dalos Peres shenecholin chai, peres which are eaten raw. Let's skip out that source because it's a little more technical. Probably I should have highlighted it more. So the next one, the Ramah, even things which are eaten raw cannot be cooked on Shabbos. The first source also says it, but just I don't want to get into the technicalities of the halacha, so we'll skip that one out. Now, the Rambam has a lone voice view on this matter, and I printed the Rambam here on the third line in this source. Rambam Perik Tes Hilchos Shabbos Halacha Gimel Hamavashal al Ha'ur, one who cooks on heat al Ha'ur. Dover Shu Mavushal Kol Sarko, something which is already completely cooked. O Dover She'einu Tzorich Bishul, something that doesn't need klal, doesn't need to be cooked at all because it's nechel chai. Potur is exempt from Melechas Shabbos. You are not chayav min haTorah for cooking something which can be eaten raw. So says the Rambam. Ask the Poskim. I don't understand. Mon can seemingly be eaten raw. Why do I think mon can be eaten raw? Because we have the Midrash that says that mon can assume any taste. We saw the Gemara in Yuma on the last page, which the Gemara said to a youngster, a child that tastes like honey, to an elderly person like oil, to an adult like bread. So mon can be eaten raw, mon can be eaten immediately. How does the Pasuk tell us that Moshe turned to the Jewish people and said, mon is only to be delivered on Friday, lechem mishnah, that which is cooked, that which is baked, but you can't bake and cook on Shabbos. According to the Rambam, there's no problem, at least as far as Torah law is concerned, with cooking or baking something that can be eaten raw on Shabbos. Why should there have been a problem with cooking and baking on cooking and baking the mon? So again, let's look at the end of page 1. Just look at the Poskim. The people turn to Moshe in Poskim 21 and 22, and they say, it's Friday. How come that which we have gathered is a double portion, is lechem mishnah? Answers Moshe, Vayom Aleim, this is Posuk 23 at the bottom of page 1 in the source. Vayom Aleim, Moshe says to them, Hu Hashem? Dear Hashem, this is what Hashem says. Shabbos Kodesh Hashem. Tomorrow will be Shabbos, a day of rest, a day which you shouldn't do work. Machar, tomorrow, that which is already baked, bake that which needs to be baked, cook that which needs to be cooked, because this day is Friday. Do your preparations for Shabbos, because on Shabbos you won't be able to cook or bake them on. So we seem to have an explicit source against the Rambam. Now, this question generated an enormous amount of discussion, a very fascinating question, and maybe is linked to a broader debate around the role of Midrashim in Halacha, and as to whether the Rambam indeed adopted this stance that mon was edible, raw, or not. Equally, it may force us to think in a more sophisticated manner about this idea that mon could taste like anything. And here the Chasam Sofer steps in. And the Chasam Sofer says, what do we do with the Midrash that mon could taste like anything? Why? Why is that necessary? It's just a treat for the Jewish people, it's nice, but why is that part of the miracle? We saw Rabbi Yosef Engel, who speculated, maybe even in some way or other, actually became that food or not. Chasam Sofer says we need to think in a completely different manner. We've already seen the Gemara, and the Gemara told us that mon is the refinement of food. It's the essence of food. It's a spiritual food. It's a food which embodies the words of Hashem, that spirituality that feeds us, as opposed to physicality that feeds us. All foods have different tastes. Every food has a different quality. Do you know why there's a difference between an apple and an orange and a potato and a carrot and a burger and everything else? Because each one gives us a different sample of the pleasures of this world, a different nutrition, a different way of benefiting from this life, and ultimately, therefore, a different spiritual pathway to draw close to Hashem. Mon had all these tastes within it. Mon could taste like anything. Whichever form of inspiration, appreciation, connection to Hashem that you wanted, this could be found in mon. It's an elevating model of what we're meant to reflect upon and meditate upon as we eat. The foods that have different tastes don't just happen to have different tastes. We can enjoy them as different tastes, but they grant us a different flavor of connecting to Hashem. When you eat an orange, the connection to Hashem is that of the experience of an orange. And when you eat an apple, it's the connection to Hashem of the experience of an apple. And when you have meat, it's meat. And when you have bread, and when you have wine, it's wine. These are different experiences of the beauty and enjoyment and gift of Olam Hazeh that Hashem has given us. And if we're sensitive, each one gives us a different aspect or element of appreciation, much like a different piece of music inspires us differently, or a different type of scenery inspires us differently. When you go to the mountains, you draw one way of seeing my God, Hashem, how great are your deeds, O God. When you go to the sea, you see another way of seeing it. When you have one flavored foods, you see and appreciate the connection and kindness of Hashem in one way. When you have a different flavored foods, you see and appreciate it in a second way. Therefore, says the Chasam Sofer, the mon carries within it all these different flavors of Tam, all these different ways of connecting to Hashem. This doesn't tell us anything miraculous about the actual substance of the mon. Maybe indeed the mon needed cooking or preparing in some shape or form. There's Midrashim that suggest that different madrigas, different levels of people, Sadiqim and Rishonim needed to prepare it to different degrees of preparation. We've misunderstood the Gemara that tells us that it can taste of anything. It's not telling us that the mon is instantly edible or not. It's telling us that each person draws out of the mon whatever it is they need to draw out as spiritual sustenance. So says the Chasam Sofer. So again, what started off as an interesting, almost dry application of halacha from a medrash could the mon be cooked on Shabbos or not? Surely that would depend on the Rambam about whether foods which are edible raw can be cooked or not. In the inspiring words of the Chasam Sofer, ends up as forcing us to think more in a more sophisticated manner about what we mean about mon tasting like anything at all. So this is a third halachic discussion. The final halachic discussion is around the issue of storing the mon after they entered Eretz Yisrael. Now, if you look in source in the top source in the final section on page 4, I've cited a Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Ches Omid Beis, and here we need to turn back to our Psukim and look at Pasuk 35, which is printed on page 2, and the Pasuk says, "B'nei Yisrael ochves hamon aboim shana." The Jewish people ate the mon for 40 years. Ad boam al Eretz Meshavos, till they came to an inhabited land. Es hamon ochlu, the mon they ate. Ad boam el Ketzei Eretz Canaan, till they came to the borders of the land of Canaan. Now, this is a sort of poetic style pasuk, which repeats in different forms really the same idea. They ate the mon for 40 years till they arrived. However, there's a problem. The two descriptions are not identical. One pasuk seems to say, or one line seems to say, so again, we're on page 2 here looking at pasuk 35. One line seems to say that they ate them on till they arrived in civilization. The other one seems to say they ate them on till they arrived at the borders of the land of Canaan. Which one was it? Says the Gemara, based on this, that the mon stopped falling on the edge of Eretz Yisrael at the border. In other words, the mon is a product of the Midbar. And as soon as they leave the Midbar, the mon stops falling. And this coincides with the death of Moshe. So Moshe dies and the mon ceases. They're on Ketzei Eretz Canaan, on the border of Eretz Canaan. However, the supply of the mon lasted until they enter civilization, i.e. until they enter Eretz Yisrael, or Eretz Canaan at the time, and they're able to get their first wheat from the lands of Israel, which the Gemara calculates is a 30-day, from the 7th of Adar until the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Pesach, which is the time we bring the Omer offering, and therefore it lasts for 30 days, and it depends on the carbon Omer on the Omer offering. Now, this is all very well, but it therefore turns out that they transgressed a lav in the Torah. Because again, let's have a look at the Psukim. Moshe is very definitive that no mon should be left over until the next morning. Let's have a look at the Psukim. Vayomer Moshe, Pasuk 19, back on page 1. Vayomer Moshe says to them, Ish, no person, al yosem imenu ad boker. Don't leave over till the morning. Al yotem imenu ad boker. You're not allowed to leave over mon. So how could Klal Yisrael leave over mon till the next morning? So there's 3 answers at least given to this question, and again they just help illuminate a little bit more detail about what the mon might have been. So again, just to summarize this final question of Poskim, the Gemara teaches us, based upon this interesting nuance of language, that the mon was eaten, fell until the borders of the land of Israel, but then was eaten for the next 30 days, seemingly transgressing what the Pasuk explicitly tells us, which is don't leave over the mon until the next day. Now, the Sefano on discussing why it is wrong to leave mon over until the next day, and why people did leave mon over, and why Moshe got angry. If you look at the sequence of Psukim again, Pasuk 19, Moshe says don't leave anything over. Pasuk 20, it says, V'lo shama Moshe didn't leave over, they left over till the next day, and it went moldy, it went wormy. Pasuk 20, Vayiktzif alei Moshe, Moshe was wroth with them, as it says in English. Moshe was angry with them, he was furious for not leaving over. Says this Fano, why is Moshe angry? Ki omnon, this is answer 1 in the middle of page 4. Ki omnon lo korazab itnei hayosa yotem ikdei sivom. It wasn't that it was left over because they became full and therefore they happened to leave over. They left it over in order to test and trial. The Ibn Ezra says, the reason is given, one shouldn't leave over to destroy till the next day, but one should trust in God. That tomorrow the one will go down. The Beshalach in the Posuk isn't telling you that there's a mitzvah to eat it all. The Beshalach in the Posuk is telling you don't leave over, in order to demonstrate unreliability, don't save until tomorrow. Okay, so according to this understanding, the reason it's wrong to leave over is as a sign of trust in Hashem. This is the incubator period of the Jewish people. These are the 40 years of incubation, and this is giving them a message for all time, which is you're going to go into Eretz Yisrael, you're going to have to earn your own parnasa, your own livelihood, but realize that ultimately parnasa, livelihood, is in the hands of Hashem, and trust in Him. Don't leave mon over. Now, in this model, we can suggest that the prohibition is therefore only if someone deliberately leaves mon over until the next day in order to test. If someone eats and is satiated and happens to leave over, there's no problem at all. And therefore, on the last day of Moshe's life, evidently, somehow or other, this mon was enough in supply to last everyone for 30 days. So people ate and they had left over. They didn't transgress the Issa. So according to the Sforno, we can suggest there's no mitzvah to discard leftover mon. The Issa is don't deliberately leave over mon. That's the Sforno's explanation. The Ibn Ezra that's cited seems to say not like that. If we continue the Ibn Ezra here in answer 1, he says, if there's leftover that is too much to eat, it's a mitzvah to discard it. One has to throw it away. So we have here a machlokas seemingly between perhaps the Sforno and Ibn Ezra. Is the mitzvah not to deliberately leave over because that demonstrates a lack of trust? But if you happen to leave over, no problem. Or is the mitzvah to discard the mon that's left over? According to the first model, if there happens to be mon left over, there's no transgression. And therefore, for the Jewish people, if they found that the mon somehow sufficed for the 30 days after the death of Moshe, this would be sufficient. This is one possible answer to the question. A second answer to the question is based upon a very fascinating Tosfos in the name of a very early authority, Rav Sar Shalom Gaon. So we know in the following the time of the sealing of the Gemara, around about the year 500 in the Common Era, until the year 900 or so, the leaders of the Jewish people were the Gaonim, who lived in Bavel. Again, those who went on the Geniza trip, we discussed this at great length. The insights that we've learned from about the era of the Gaonim, but these are the leaders of the Jewish people. They're quite mysterious figures. We don't know that much about them, and we don't know that much about what they say. But the Tosfos cites Rav Sar Shalom Gaon that Moshe died on Shabbos afternoon. Now, there is a interesting minhag we have, which is reflected in the nusach of Tefillah, the feel of Shabbos afternoon, which is there's an element of avelus that creeps into Shabbos afternoon. The tune that we use for mincha has an avelus type tune to it, and we say tzidkos chotzedek. We say words of tziduk hadin on Shabbos afternoon after the Amidah of mincha. So there are psukim which are generally said at a time of avelus, in which we declare our belief in the righteousness of God, even in the face of suffering. And this is called tziduk hadin, justifying the righteousness of harsh judgments. And this is said at a levaya, a funeral, and on other occasions. Now, remarkably and bizarrely, Shabbos afternoon, after the Amidah, we say etc. We say psukim of tziduk hadin, of justifying the strictness of Hashem's judgment. Now, why do we do this? Why does the mood turn a little somber on Shabbos afternoon? So one could give several explanations. Shabbos is on the way in, Shabbos is on the way out, and we're beginning to mourn the loss of Shabbos. It seems a little out of accord to Shabbos. By the way, this is also reflected in, according to some in the Minhag Ashkenaz, that we say Azkar L'Shomas on Shabbos afternoon. So our Minhag in our shul and many other shuls is that we don't say a memorial prayer in the morning on Shabbos. However, in the afternoon on Shabbos at Mincha, we say Kel Manarachim, we say a Yizkar of sorts on Shabbos afternoon.
So because of Tzedek, we don't say on days when there's no Tachlim.
No. Yes, absolutely. So you see, you actually don't miss out on Tachlim days. So you see that it somehow has this somber nature. Says Rav Sar Shalom Gaon, Moshe died at Mincha on Shabbos, and this is a mourning for the loss of Moshe. A very remarkable idea. This is the mourning for the loss of Moshe, because this is a time of Avedus. It's a time when we miss Moshe and we're aware of his departure. And David Melech died on the first day of Shavuos, which at the year of Matan Torah was a Shabbos. I don't know if in the year of his death it was a Shabbos or not. Yeah. So, sorry? You think it was a Shabbos that year also? Was a Shabbos. Okay, interesting. Okay. Anyway, this is the view that Tosfos brings from Rav Sasha Gaon. Then Tosfos brings those who argue, and he does a calculation about the dates, about how Pesach fell that year, and various other things, and it's not so clear cut. But either way, this reaches the Ramah and the Mishnah Berurah level discussion about why we say Tzidkos Sedek on Shabbos and how it can possibly be said. Now, this can lead us to a second suggestion, because there is one portion of Mon which there isn't a mitzvah to chuck out and discard, and you are allowed to leave overnight, which is the Mon that falls on Friday because we save it for Shabbos. So evidently the law of leaving over Mon doesn't apply to Mon that falls on Friday, because there the mitzvah is to leave it over. So this gives us a second answer to the question. The Mon that fell on the day of Moshe's death, which lasted for 30 days, didn't fall on the day of Moshe's death. It fell on Friday, and Moshe died on the Shabbos. Now, Friday Mon doesn't have the mitzvah of discarding it, and therefore this could be a second suggestion as to why they were allowed to keep them on for 30 days, because it didn't have the mitzvah of discarding it. Fascinatingly, the Sofano comments that this isn't correct. The Sofano says that the Mon that fell on Friday, the prohibition to leave it over doesn't apply on Shabbos, but you mustn't leave over after Shabbos. So basically, we have a conceptual argument over here. Halacha Maisek, and we also had to ask Moshe Rabbeinu the Shaila, Mon, which there's a mitzvah to always discard it. Clearly, Friday Mon you don't have to discard. Does that mean you can keep it just for Shabbos, or does that mean you can keep it for all time? In which case, we would have a second explanation as to how they could leave it over, because it's Shabbos Friday Mon, and Friday Mon doesn't have to be discarded. The third explanation that one can give to this is a very interesting one, and just got me reflecting on the difference between nature and miracles. This was a comment that I saw cited in the name of Rav Elyashiv when he gave his Gemara share on this Gemara, and he was asked this question, and he linked this to a broader topic of discussion which we started off with. In this sense, it brings the circle, we come back full circle, to what is the nature of items produced through miraculous means. What is their halachic status? Do they have the status of the object themselves or not? So wine, tasting water from the Be'er of Miriam that tastes like wine, does it have the halachic status of wine? Can it be used for Kiddush? Oil of the the miracle of Hanukkah, does it have the halachic status of oil? Bread, Mon, does it have the halachic status of bread? And Rabbi Yashiv suggests that the Mon that fell through the 40 years became a natural type of experience. Any miracle that is repeated inevitably ceases in a sense to be miraculous and becomes an application of Teva, type of nature. Is it, T'chias HaMeisim, the revival of the dead, is a remarkable experience. The idea that something can be buried in the ground and sprouts back to life is a miracle. T'chias HaMeisim. If we stood there in the base Kavaros and the fiddler on the roof type scene, and we saw the earth cracking open and the dead re-emerging, this would be a most remarkable experience. But we see this the whole time. A seed is put in the ground, and the seed is buried, and it erodes, and out of it cracks open, and new life springs forth. So what is the nature of that which is miraculous and that which is teva? Really, that which becomes regular, that which is routine, and that which is constant. And therefore he suggests that the Mon of the 40 years had become regular Mon, about which the halachic rules apply, and the halachic rule was do not leave over, discard such Mon. The Mon of the day of the death of Moshe is unusual Mon, it's miraculous Mon, it's the last falling of Mon. It's Mon which lasts evidently for 40 days. It's Mon which, like the oil of the Hanukkah candle, it comes miraculously into existence. He cites a Radak. The Radak is commenting on the story of Elisha, who does the miracle for the impoverished woman, and she pours oil out of her jug, and it falls and it pours and it pours. This is Malachim, the 4th chapter, the 2nd part of Malachim, and she has plentiful supplies of oil, which she's able to sell to everyone. The Radak cites a Tosefta, a Brisa, in which the woman turns to Elisha and says, do I have to take Trumas and Masras from this? Do I have to tithe this or not? And Elisha responds, this is oil of miracle, not natural oil, and therefore the halacha doesn't apply to it. And therefore maybe the Manna of the of the last day of Moshe's life is like the oil produced by Elisha, has within it a bounty which is unnatural, and therefore has the status of miraculous oil about which classic halacha doesn't apply. I just want to conclude by a couple of moments of reflection on this halacha to discard the mon. The Pasuk tells us that the mon had to be put aside. Moshe instructed Aaron, put the mon in a vase and keep it so it can be seen in the future. This is Pasuk 33, printed on page 2. Aaron puts it in a vase and put it there. Why? So that it should be a reminder through the generations. What's it meant to remind us of? Says the Malbim, it's meant to remind us of that the key to Parnasa, ultimately the key to economic success, is ultimately in the hands of Hashem. We have to make our efforts, we have to do our shtadlus, obviously, but we should always remember that our success, as much as it, of course, derives from hard work and effort, ultimately is from well beyond us. Our talents, our abilities, the surroundings, our health, which allows us to function, is granted to us. And in a very beautiful message, the Malbim says, the Mon reminds us that the key to our prosperity is from Hashem. It reminds us that ultimately lechem, all lechem that we have is lechem min hashamayim, is heavenly bread, not lechem min oret. If you look at the sequence of psukim in Devarim, the whole chapter, and I think I mentioned this before, that speaks about Birchas Hamazon, it begins by saying this explicitly. It says, Mon used to fall. You're now entering the lands of Israel, where you're going to grow your own food. Don't grow arrogant. Don't become arrogant and smug. But v'achalta v'starta v'irachta. Remember that this food is from Hashem, not from your own might and talents. In other words, whenever we bench, whenever we make a bracha, we are turning physical food into mon. We can still eat mon to this day. How can we still eat mon to this day? By saying the brachas on it. As the Hasidic sources said, when we make a bracha on food, we're drawing the mon out that's buried within the food. They maybe didn't have to say the bracha on mon because it was naturally mon. But our food isn't naturally mon, but when we make a bracha on it, have a look at the beautiful chapter 8 in Sefer Devarim, and you'll see very, very clearly it says that Birchas Hamazon is a way of making all bread into food. We shouldn't be obsessed, says the Malbim, with the desire to amass wealth. The Mon reminds us, if you've got enough for today, again, this doesn't mean irresponsible living or anything like that, but within reason, you don't need to accumulate. It reminds us not to have an anxiety about tomorrow. Again, we have to behave sensibly, but the Vayiksosh Moshe gets angry at those who are setting them on aside. We learn that, and we also learn that by honouring Shabbos, finally, says the Malbim, the sustenance for the rest of the week is assured. This is the message of Malbim, and what we've seen is the thoughts of four halachic discussions: the after bracha on Mon, Birchas Hamazon; the before bracha on Mon, what bracha we say on it; the bishul on Shabbos, where the cooking applies to Mon, and the thoughts of the Chasam Sofer; and finally storing Mon and halacha, to what degree is that which is regular, natural, or unnatural. So these are some insights from, remarkably enough, halachists who looked at Mon from a serious halachic perspective, and nonetheless drifted into offering us hashkafic and philosophical and midrashic insights.
There are practical consequences. They're demonstrated by the fact that you don't leave over you can't leave over, you can leave over on Friday, because you know you're not getting on the next day. They knew that after Moshe died, they weren't going to get it. So the Isra stopped applying. So they didn't have to rely on getting on the next day.
What you're saying is correct, but the Posuk is explicit that the Issa doesn't apply when you leave it on the when you leave over on the Friday. In other words, it's not just that the logic. You're right. The logic behind the mitzvah doesn't apply because there's no act of rebellion leaving over, and the Posuk is you're saying with Moshe's death also. You're saying the same idea because it's not going to come. The truth is, in essence, yes, I think you're right. The Posuk, the Gemara really is arguing that that this is what the Gezeres HaKosel says in Posuk Lamatei. It's saying you're going to eat mon till the border of the desert, but you're going to continue eating mon till you go into the land of Israel. In other words, this is the one time when you're allowed to keep mon over. Yeah.
You were talking about which bracha we're making on the mon, and there are a couple of sources that said that we don't make the bracha at all because it's pure spirituality. And yet we know that even with things that are pure spirituality, man still has the potential to turn that for the bad and to make that not for Hashem. So we know that our tefillah is more for us. It's for us, it's not for Hashem. So doesn't that come into it to some extent that yes, we're getting this pure spirituality, and yet still our relationship with it and with Hashem more to the point?
So,
Should require.
very interesting point. I had a similar thought also. Again, I was asked to repeat things for the recording, so I'll say that. The question is, even spirituality can be corrupted, and therefore maybe one shouldn't make a bracha on that. I had a suggestion. The truth is, we make brachas even on mitzvahs because of this idea that even a mitzvah can be done in a manner that is devoid of spirituality or full of spirituality. And therefore we can argue, even in line with the thinking of the Hasidic thinkers, that say that eating mon is a pure spiritual experience. So you don't have to make a bechas hanenin on it. You don't have to say, you don't have to say a physical bracha on it, on food, but you should make a bracha analogous to bechas hamitzvahs. When you say hamotzi lechem min hashamayim, that's analogous to bechas hamitzvahs, that my spiritual endeavor should be correct, rather than a bracha made on eating, which is that my physical endeavor should be appropriate and correct. So I had a similar thought to that. It would have the nature of a different sort of bracha.
And in a completely different area, you're talking about I can't remember who you said that the mon, it tasted of everything, but it tasted of everything because it's our relationship, the food.
The chasam sofa, yes.
Sorry, thank you, chasam sofa, the relationship. Does that present problems then when people choose to become vegetarian or vegan and stop eating various foods? And is there anything to do with that? Therefore, on what we're getting in our relationship to Hashem through that taste, etc.
So there is maybe I'll give a dedicated share on veganism and vegetarianism and so on. All I will say is there's a very famous quote from Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, who says that anyone who doesn't visit Alps is osudlit in Esadin. And the point he's trying to bring out is it's not that is that the world was created to give us an appreciation of many things, and to fully relate to Hashem, we need to be able to appreciate those things. Now, in other words, before one considers abstaining from any elements of this world, one has to realize one's losing something by so doing. Think of the Nazir with depriving himself of yayin and like wine, and the idea that the Nazir has to bring in carbon chatos. So abstaining is always a bit of a double-edged sword. Yeah, it can be a tool temporarily in the service of Hashem in order to remove oneself from a coarse physicality. But ultimately, our way of connecting to Hashem is we're embodied souls. We're not just souls; it's through physical means. Yeah. Okay, everyone, a good evening. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you.
Thank you very much.